Alrighty kids, in this lesson we're going to be discussing what's in topic 11.2, which is all about fractions, decimals, and percents. You'll need to open your book to pages 290 and 291. So why don't you pause the video and get your book set up. Okay, now I'm going to give you a little bit of information that's not found in the book. Kind of simplify and overview what it is that you're going to be doing in this lesson. Alright, one of the things I want to point out is that to convert from a fraction to a percent, you will go through three phases. So when we're going from a fraction to a percent, you basically are going to go through three phases, okay, with your numbers. You will start off with a fraction, then you will go to a decimal, and then you will convert your decimal to a percent. So basically, you have a fraction that will become a decimal that will become a percent. Okay? And those phases are pretty easy to get through if you take your time. So we have phase 1 is the fraction, phase 2 is the decimal, and phase 3 is the percent. And I'm going to give you an example of what we mean using a very simple, very common fraction that we all are used to working with. And that would be 1/2. Okay? Now, one of the things that we want to do is we want to take this fraction 1/2 and we want to turn it into a decimal. Now, most of us know that 1/2 is going to be 5/10. Okay? But if we want to turn this into a percent, we have to think of 5/10 as the equivalent form of 50 hundredths. Okay? So it's really important that we think of 5/10 as 50 hundredths. They give you the same amount, except for we're talking about hundredths instead of tenths. Now, once we have it in the hundredths, we can then say, okay, all we have to do is move our decimal point over and create the percent symbol and rewrite our digits. And so what we would have is 50%. So 1/2 turned to a decimal is 5/10, create an equivalent of 50 hundredths, and then simply move our decimal point to the right and turn it into a percent symbol. Alright, so that is just the basics of it. Another example that I could show you would be using the fraction 6/12, which again isn't a very complicated fraction to be working with, because we know that this fraction actually in lowest terms is 1/2. And so if this is 1/2, once again, we know that it will be 5/10, which is equivalent to 50 hundredths, which of course, all you have to do is once you have your 50 hundredths, all you have to do is turn it into your percent, which would be 50%. Alright? So that's pretty much all you're going to be doing. Now, the one thing that you do want to keep in mind, and that is that if you have a fraction such as 6/12, that you can right away determine the decimal by taking your top term and dividing it by your bottom term. Now remember, you're going to have to provide a decimal point and then annex some zeros. Now when you're doing percents, you want to at least annex 2 zeros, because you're going to be dividing out to the hundredths. So 12 will go into 60 5 times. 5 times 12 is 60. So we would subtract, and we end up with 0. So right here is where we would terminate it normally, but we want to go out to the hundredths. So of course 12 can't go into 0, so you're going to say 0. And so there you can see where we get our 50 hundredths, which we will be able to convert into our percent. Okay? And this method up here is how you're probably always going to find your percents. You're almost always going to take this fraction, treat it as a division expression, get your decimal to the hundredths place value, and then turn it into a percent. Alright? Now, of course, if you can convert a fraction to a percent, you can turn a percent back into a fraction. So to convert a percent to a fraction, you will go through 3 phases as well. And these phases begin with your percent, because you're going from a percent to a fraction. So you'll go from a percent to a decimal, and eventually you will end as a fraction. Alright, so you'll go from the percent, rewrite it as a decimal, and then rewrite it as a fraction. So I'll give you a little example here. Okay, so phase 1, phase 2, and we'll start with a pretty simple example, which would be 75%. So we have 75%, and the first thing we want to do is write it as a decimal. Well, in order to do that, it's pretty simple. We just have to get rid of the percent symbol and turn it back into a decimal, which means we're going to take this and we're going to move it over 2 place values to the left and make it a decimal. So what we will end up with is 75 hundredths. Now, once we have 75 hundredths, we're then going to move on to the fraction phase. Now, 75 hundredths is 75 to 100 as a fraction. Okay? And what we want to remember, though, is we want to simplify this down, and so we would divide that in order to get the simplest form. And we would divide by the greatest common factor of 25, both the top and the bottom terms of the fraction, and we would end up with 3/4 as our fraction. So you can see how you go from 75% to a decimal, and then from your decimal to a fraction, which has to be reduced into lowest terms. Okay? And so that's kind of a nice example for us to follow along with. Another example that I would like to show you related to this same process would be as if I gave you 24%. Okay? So if we take a look, 24% is what we want, not 25. So if we take 24% and we think of it as a percent, we know that percents are based on 100. So when we rewrite it as a decimal, we're going to write it as 24 hundredths. Okay? And then once we have it as a decimal, we can then write it as a fraction, and it would be 24 over 100. Now, we obviously know that we have 2 even numbers, so we can simplify that and reduce it using the greatest common factor of both numbers. And in this case, the greatest common factor would be 4. So we're going to divide both terms by 4. And 24 divided by 4 is 6. 100 divided by 24 is 25. So what we have here is 6/25, because we've divided both of these by the greatest common factor of 4. 24 divided by 4 is 6. 100 divided by 4 is 25. So 6/25 is 24%. Alright? So anyways, now what we're going to do is we're going to actually take a look at the Pearson material. And you'll notice that they tell us that we're working with fraction, decimals, and percents. They ask us our opening question, how are fractions and decimals and percents related to one another? Fractions, decimals, and percents are 3 ways to show proportions of a whole. The circle graph shows each in different form. Okay, so we have 35% of the circle graph is blue, 30% of it is orange, 3/5 is blue, 30% of it is orange, and 10 hundredths is green. Okay, and then what they do is they ask us to write 30% as a fraction and as a decimal. So we're going to take 30% and we're going to write it as a fraction and a decimal. But then they want us to take the green section and write 10 hundredths as a fraction and as a percent. So they give us the process, and we want to take 30% and write it as a fraction and a decimal. So what we have is a percent compares a number to 100. So you can write 30% as a fraction and as a decimal. And so here we have our 30%, and what they've done first is they have created a fraction. Alright, so it would be 30 over 100. Then they simplify that, and we have 30 over 100 divided by the greatest common factor of 10, which is 3, and then we have 100 divided by 10, which is 10. So as a fraction, 30% is 3/10. And then down below, they say 30% can be written as 3/10 or 30 hundredths. And remember that if you took 3/10 and you wrote it as a decimal, it would look like this. And then if we wanted to write it as hundredths, you could just create the equivalent form. Then they talk about taking 10 hundredths and writing it as a fraction and as a percent. So you take your decimal and you simply write it as a fraction. It's 10 hundredths, so that's what we have, and then you simplify it using the greatest common factor of 10. So we're going to divide both terms by 10. 10 divided by 10 is 1, and 100 divided by 10 is 10. And so 10 hundredths is 1/10 as a fraction. If you wanted to switch that over to a percent, then you just simply take your decimal and you write it as a fraction with 100 as your denominator and turn it over to 10%. So 10 hundredths can also be written as 1/10 or as 10%. Okay? So that's pretty much how the lesson goes over it. The Pearson people also show you how you can change a fraction to a decimal and a percent using division, much the way I showed you. And you can see where you take your top term and divide it by your bottom term. And you have to annex a 0 because 5 can't go into 3, but it can go into 36 times, and then it terminates. And so what you end up with is 6/10, but you're turning it into a percent, so you annex a 0 on the end of it, so you have 60 hundredths. Once you have 60 hundredths, then you can simply rewrite it as 60%. Then they show you how you can use a proportion, and you would take your fraction and you'd say, okay, I have 3/5, and I want to go change over to an amount that is based on 100, and so I would have to go from 5 to 100. And what they do is they show you that you would multiply 3 times 100 would be equal to 5 times x. And then you want to simplify this amount down, so we would have 300 equals 5x, and then we want to get the x by itself, so we're going to divide both sides by 5. 300 divided by 5 is 60, and 5 divided by 5 is 1, but you wouldn't need it because of the identity property, so you'd get x by itself alone. And so what you end up with is 3/5 equals 60 hundredths, because x is equal to 60, and then 60 hundredths, of course, is 60%. And you can see that over here on these two number lines, how they compare. And they simply set them up so that your amounts would be the same percentage. So anyways, what we want to do now is we want to look on page 292 and see if you can convert these numbers into two other numbers. So see if you can change 38% into both a fraction and a decimal, and then the same with the rest of them. So pause the video and see if you can solve these problems. Alright, let's take a look at how you did. 38%, when you write it as a decimal, is going to be 38 hundredths, because all you do is take your percent sign, move it 2 places to the left, and you create your hundredths, and it's 38 hundredths. As a fraction, it would be 19/50ths. Now, the way you come up with 19/50ths is you have to remember that 38 hundredths, which is our decimal, okay, 38 hundredths written as a fraction is not in lowest terms. So if we divide both 38 and 100 by 2, you'll see that we get a fraction which is simplified. So we have to divide both by 2, and we will get our simplified fraction, which is 19/50ths. Alright, let's take a look at number 13, 7/8. Well, 7/8, when you write it as a decimal, is 875 thousandths. Now, that's a pretty complicated problem, but again, the best way to figure this out is to simply take 7/8 and to treat it as a division process or algorithm. So you would take your 7, you'd put it on the inside, your 8 out here, and 8 can't go into 7, so we want to put a decimal point in, and we're going to take it out to the hundredths to begin with, and we can always take it out further if we need to, because we can annex more zeros. 8 will go into 70 a total of 8 times. 8 times 8 is 64, and if we subtract, you'll see that we have 6 as a partial remainder. Bring down our 0. 8 into 60 will go 7 times. 7 times 8 is 56. And then we subtract again, and we end up with 4. And then we're going to annex another 0 here because we haven't terminated yet. And we know we don't have to round because 8 will go evenly into 45 times. 5 times 8 is 40. And we can terminate this amount, okay? And so that's how we came up with our decimal. Then, if we were going to write that as a percent, all you have to do is remember that you're going to move this decimal point 2 places over and then write your percent symbol. So our percent would be 87 5/10%. Alright? And so you can have half of a percent, which will come up in the next lesson. Let's take a look at number 15. Okay. Problem number 15, they wanted you to take 1/3 and turn it into a decimal and a percent. As a decimal, it is 33 3/10%, and as a percent, it's 33 3/10%, and as a decimal, it is 3/10 repeating. Okay? Then we look at number 6. Now, we look at number 16, and the correct answer for number 16 is 65%, written as a decimal is 65 hundredths, and as a fraction it would be 13/20ths. Alright, so you can see where we have some new things going on here. We have our percent, once again using a decimal, as well as a repeating number in our decimal. Over here we have 65%, which is fine, but then we had to simplify it. Now, I might want to address this here with you right now. And what we want to do is, if we turn this into a percent, it's usually easier to start with your decimal. So in other words, if we add 1/3 and we wanted to turn that into a percent, what we would do is we would start by creating the decimal. It's just easier that way. Alright? And again, you would have to annex zeros, and 3 can't go into 10. It goes 3 can't go into 1, but it can go into 10 3 times. So you end up with 9. 10 take away 9 is 1. annex a 0, and 3 into 10 will go a total of 3 times. And you can see that we're beginning to get this repeating pattern as we continue to annex zeros. All right? And so you know that it's going to be the decimal of 3 repeating. Well, if you're going to turn this into a percent, you can do a number of things. You could either round it to a whole percent, or you can include a tenth of a percent. And that's how they came up with that. And then again, over here, if you were to take 65 hundredths and write it as a fraction, you would then simplify it by dividing by the greatest common factor. And in this case, the greatest common factor is going to be 5. And so when you divide 65 by 5, you get 13. And when you divide 100 by 5, you end up with 20. Okay? So that's how you would handle these two situations. All right, let's take a look at our last two problems and see how we did. And we have 29%, and we want to write it as a fraction, which would be 29 over 100. And as a decimal, it would be 29 hundredths. All right. Now, this was kind of easy because 29 hundredths is simplified. And so all we have to do is think of it as 29 hundredths, just like that. Okay? And then our last one is kind of interesting. We have 100th, and if we write that as a percent, that would be 1%, and as a fraction, it would be 100th. All right? So let's go on to the next set of problems, and let's take a look at problem 21. They have two parts here. And what they're asking us, many chemical elements can be found in Earth's atmosphere. Use the circle graph to answer the following questions. Okay, so here's our circle graph. You have orange is nitrogen, green is oxygen, and yellow, this little 1%, represents other gases. Okay, all of these together, if you add them up, equal 100%. Okay, and so they give us two questions, and they say, what fraction of Earth's atmosphere is made up of nitrogen? So you're going to want to figure that out. And then it says, what part of Earth's atmosphere is made up of oxygen? And so they want you to write that as a decimal. Okay, so pause the video and see if you can solve those problems. All right, let's see how you did here. Let's take a look at A and see how they came up with their answer. Okay, the answer for A is 78 hundredths, which equals 39 50ths. All right, and this is how they came up with it. You're talking about what fraction of the Earth's atmosphere is nitrogen. Well, nitrogen is 78% of our atmosphere. So if we take 78% and we say to ourselves, okay, we need to take 78% and we want to write that as a decimal, which would be 78 hundredths. Okay, we can then create a fraction that is 78 hundredths. And 78 hundredths is a great fraction, but we want to make sure that we simplify it. So we're going to take both the numerator and the denominator, and we're going to divide them by 2. So 78 divided by 2 is going to be 39, and of course 100 divided by 2 is going to be 50. And so that's how we got 39 50ths. And now let's see how you did with part B. All right, let's take a look at it. Part B, they wanted you to write the identify how much of the Earth's atmosphere is oxygen and then write it as a decimal. Well, 21% of Earth's atmosphere is oxygen, and the answer to this question would be 21%, or 21 hundredths. So if you write it as a decimal, all you have to remember is that 21%, okay, you take your decimal and you move it 2 places to the left, and if you want, you can annex a 0 in there, and you get 21 hundredths because percents are based on hundredths. Alright, hopefully this video helped you out if you were absent or you needed a little bit more information than what was covered in class. If you have any further questions, feel free to see me or ask your parents for help.